All right, so you might be asking now, all right, we got these John Madden looking graphs basically showing that if you have a market, everything is good. Lowest cost producers, highest willingness to pay consumers, Pareto efficient. You can't increase total surplus from the market. Why would we ever want to do something else? Why would we ever want like a government to step in? Okay, so I spent 10 minutes last lecture talking about the downsides of command economies. Now let's talk about some of the downsides of markets. Okay. So we call market failure basically the inability of a market to generate, high utility or the fairest distribution of utility. Okay. So you might have market failure in the example of imperfect competition. Okay, what does that mean? So imagine you had a monopoly, and the monopolist decided to raise the prices in order to extract as much profit from you as possible. Legally and legally they're able to do so. Pricing wise, it might be in their best interest to do so, but it's definitely not in your best interest, and there might be some ethical concerns about why that might be the case, or about why that might not be so great. So imagine there's like two producers, and they both start acting like a monopoly. In doing so, they're extracting consumer surplus. They're colluding basically. They're coordinating their pricing strategies to act like a monopoly. In doing so, they're extracting consumer surplus away from you and moving it to themselves. They might do that by underproducing the good. They might do that by just increasing price or usually one of the two things: underproducing the good, decreasing price, maybe dividing up the territory so that only company A gets the East Coast and only company B gets the West Coast. And it might not always look like it's collusion, but sometimes it will be. And that's anti-competitive, and it takes away consumer surplus, essentially. And when you do that, you can take away total surplus, too. So you might have, even though producer surplus benefits that, like increases for them, consumer surplus might be decreasing by more than the increase in producer surplus. So it'll be bad for total surplus. So in the case of like patents, we'll allow that to happen just because there's a high fixed cost and it incentivizes innovation. But in the case of, when there's two or three companies and they're colluding, you're less likely to see that be in the benefit of consumers or producers in general. Okay. Also with externalities, I don't know why I keep circling it, just the habit, sorry. With externalities, so imagine you have a market for paper, like I said earlier. It might be in the best interest. It might be that the lowest cost producer produces the paper, the highest willingness to pay consumers buy the paper. But like I said, there's pollution, and it might be so rampant that it's bad for everybody. So even though on this graph, you'll see a consumer surplus, you'll see a producer surplus, and you can't increase the total surplus. Outside of the context of the market, in terms of like who's benefiting and losing, non-parties to the transaction are seeing these negative externalities. So you might be overproducing a good relative to where it should be. So like in the real world, for example, essentially what Canada does with they have a carbon tax, and what it is like for every unit of carbon, like every I think it's ppm part per unit in the atmosphere, basically for all your pollution, for like they quantify pollution in some way or another. For all your pollution, you have to pay, let's say, 5 cents per part per unit, or per gram of carbon in the atmosphere or something like that. I don't know. Okay, what does this do? It basically increased the cost for producers to produce carbon. Okay, and you might say, okay, well, that's probably bad for total surplus as it's depicted here, right? You're basically shifting up the supply curve. You're increasing the input cost. And you're decreasing the total area between the two curves, the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. So in that sense, it is bad. But it's good in the whole because, you're decreasing the negative externality. So what does the Canadian government do? So once they've taxed the producers of the carbon, they then send the money back, the total amount of the tax revenue back to individuals, completely, like a complete flat rate back to individuals. So every individual gets like 0.1% of the tax collection, basically. So it does work to decrease the total amount of pollution, and then basically you're getting some sort of like universal basic income, some small universal basic income from that. So I don't know. I think that's a pretty neat plan, and I shouldn't be giving my opinion, but for this particular for what they're trying to do, for what they're trying to accomplish, which is decreasing greenhouse gases and minimizing the total the loss in total surplus. They are kind of doing a good job. They're essentially increasing surplus to individuals, decreasing surplus to producers, which is usually the opposite of what happens when the government steps in. There is some surplus loss, but it's probably made up for in the loss of negative externality. Okay, so overall, I think it's probably a good plan for achieving their goals. But that's a normative statement, and I'm not supposed to be making normative statements. So if you disagree, feel free. I'm not here to judge your opinion. Why else might alternatively, I want to go back to externalities before I move on. Markets can underproduce positive externalities. Okay, so think about public schooling, right? If we just had a market for school, essentially what you'd have is the richest people would be going to school and being educated and being able to help out businesses, but the workforce as a whole would be uneducated. And if you have an uneducated workforce, companies are going to suffer, right? Because imagine you're trying to hire and the pool of applicants doesn't know basic algebra or doesn't know how to spell. That's bad for a company. That's bad for the United States as a whole. Or, if you're watching this lecture from, Bulgaria or something, that's bad for them too. So public school, even though it's not a market, is probably producing a positive externality. So if we only had private schools, basically, if we only had markets for schooling, we'd be underdoing the total marginal benefit to society of schooling. We'd be underproducing positive externalities, is another way of saying that. Okay, so we want to both. The government can step in, or I shouldn't say can step in, but one of the functions of government might be to step in when markets are underproducing positive externalities, or if they're overproducing negative externalities, if they're overpolluting, or if they're underproducing, let's say, internet or healthcare or public transportation or something like that, or road building or national defense. Those are probably less controversial than the former three, the healthcare and whatever. So the government typically will see a role for itself in producing positive externalities and decreasing negative externalities, right? Even people who believe in the most limited form of government, besides anarchy, who don't believe in government at all, But even people who believe in the most limited form of government will typically agree that the government should be building roads because that's a positive externality. That's the reasoning they have behind it, whether they explicitly say so or not, or that the government should be stepping in to, prevent violence, which would be a negative externality, or increasing, national security, or maybe just producing national security. I shouldn't say increasing, which would have a positive externality. Okay. All right. What else? So markets can fail or produce suboptimal results depending on how you weigh efficiency versus equity. So by efficiency, we're talking about Pareto efficiency, allocative efficiency, productive efficiency, making sure that basically that there's no gains to be had that we're not already seizing on. Okay. Equity, however, is fairness. Okay. So think about, if we go back to the Ross-Chandler-Joey game, I shouldn't call it a game, the Ross-Chandler-Joey example somewhere. All right, here we go. We had 4 different Pareto efficient outcomes, right? But you might not judge all of these outcomes equally, right? I think that this outcome sucks. Okay? Why does Joey get all the pizzas? Joey probably doesn't even really want 8 pizzas. If you ranked his utility, he'd have diminishing marginal utility, right? So maybe this allocation has a higher total utility than this allocation. Okay? They're both Pareto efficient though. In both cases, there's no gains to be had that's not being seized upon. You can't make Ross and Chandler better off in this case without taking away from Joey. So in order to go from here to here, from 8 to 413, you'd have to take away from Joey. So this allocation is Pareto efficient. But does that mean anything? Yeah, sure, it means something, but it doesn't really help when you're in Ross and Chandler's shoes, right? It's not really fair. So even though this allocation might have a better total utility and it's fairer, this allocation is just as Pareto efficient. And generally, that's how markets tend to be. They look at the efficiency of things, but they don't care who benefits from that efficiency. So if we're talking about the gains from trade and comparative advantage in the real world, right? Let's look at the automakers in the United States. Okay, so auto production is a relatively labor intensive good. The United States typically does not have comparative advantage in labor intensive goods. So what happens? We send our auto machine plants, we send our automobile factories to Mexico. And Mexico has a comparative advantage in labor-intensive goods. So, the GM might still exist in the United States, and they might be profiting from, the imports from Mexico. But for individuals who are working in Detroit, as we produce less and less labor-intensive goods, as we make less and less cars, and Mexico makes more and more cars, because that's the comparative advantage pattern, then individual laborers are going to be like, hey, this sucks for me. I'm losing my job, right? And they have every right to complain. They've probably worked at a factory for a long time. They probably don't have a whole lot of job experience elsewhere. It's going to be very hard for them to find jobs elsewhere. But the market doesn't care. The market's not going to say, oh, you know what, this is efficient, but it's not fair to you. It's not equitable. No, the market's going to say, okay, this is efficient, so this is what we're going to do. And of course, laborers in Mexico are going to love it because there's going to be more jobs for them. And it's probably better for the world as a whole. It's probably better for the combination of the United States and Mexico because they're both seeing gains from trade. But the gains from trade that we see in the United States are typically going to be gains from trade that are going to, the higher ups at these factories, the board and the shareholders and the the CEOs and management. They're not going to be the individuals in the production line who lost their job. They're not going to be the shareholders and management. They're not going to be subsidizing. They're not going to be giving off these generous, oh, you lost your job benefits, right? They hand you your pink slip, you're done. That's not, even though there's gains from trade in the United States itself, that it's going to suck for individual auto workers. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't trade. I have very strong opinions about the matter. I'm just giving you the the trade-off. If we cut trade and we rely only on U.S. Automobile manufacturing, we could be like Hindustan Motors in India, where they're basically producing the same model of car since they've been producing since 1980, and there's been no real takeoff in their manufacturing. So that by them shutting out trade for cars, they didn't get the gains from trade, and they've kind of been stagnating. Or at least this was until the late 90s when they started liberalizing their trade policies. But on the other hand, so there's gains from trade, but on the other hand, there's losses for some people that might not be fair. And again, fairness is a normative question, so I'm not going to tell you what my definition of fairness is, if I even have a definition of fairness. But just keep in mind when you're evaluating markets, even though something might be efficient, it's not always going to be fair. Okay. So those I think are the three biggest things here. You have imperfect competition, where producers might either break the law by colluding, or they might just have a higher they might set a higher price than they need to, or underproduce in order to get to the higher price, so that they can maximize their profits, but it'll hurt consumers and it might not be beneficial for total welfare. You have externalities where if you just left things up to markets, you might overproduce a negative externality, or you might underproduce a positive externality. Okay, so you might overdo pollution because nobody's telling you not to, or you might underproduce public education because there's nobody helping you out. Okay, there's no government stepping in to allow for the positive externality from public education. And then lastly, you have this equity efficiency trade-off where even though something might lead to gains from trade, how the gains from trade are distributed might not be considered fair by all parties. Okay, and then I just talk about this leaky bucket problem. So this is just like an analogy I use to kind of describe this equity efficiency trade-off. So imagine you have two people. You have, let's say, Mark on one hand, and you have Travis on the other. And Mark's got this big old bucket of water. Okay, I say water because I'm from Philadelphia. He's got this big old bucket of water, and it's got a hole in it. So, Mark can drink the water himself, and, he's not really that thirsty, but he can drink the water, and if he drinks the water, it's Pareto efficient. Or Mark can give the water drink some water, give some water to Travis. But the water's got a hole in it. It's got a hole in the bucket. So if he gives water to Travis, as he's transporting the water, there will be like a small drip, and eventually maybe there's half the amount of water that he could give to Travis. So if Mark just drank the water himself, that would be an efficient outcome because he's not losing any of the water. If Mark gives the water to Travis, that'll be less efficient because he's losing some of the water. But Is it fair for Mark to drink the water himself? Probably not, especially if Travis is really thirsty. Now I'm getting thirsty. But even though it's efficient for Mark to drink all the water himself, is it really fair? Is it really what's best, even if it's considered quote unquote efficient? A lot of things that have been quote unquote efficient in real life have been used to justify things that are, kind of unspeakable. All right. So there are a lot of people who have concerns about markets. They tend to be, on the leftist side of the political spectrum. Either like left libertarians who would be like anarcho-socialists, or full-on communists who would be like left authoritarians. So that they generally don't like markets. They think that these three things are more prevalent than the average capitalist would suggest, and they have gripes with the market system, for better or worse. So I have this link up if you want to go check it out. But basically, it's a link to a list of demands from the World Trade Organization protests from 1999. This was basically in 1999. The World Trade Organization was hosting an event in Seattle, in Washington. And the World Trade Organization is essentially the poster boy for, comparative advantage-based trade, what you might call neoliberal trade, if you want to give it a term that you might be more familiar with. So the WTO has increased living standards across the world by basically getting these gains from trade and assigning, not like actually making an assignment, but allowing for countries to determine where their comparative advantages are, and designing a pattern of specialization and more efficient productive allocation as a productive efficiency. And they've increased living standards typically across the world, but there's definitely a lot of gripes that people might have. So, medication costs in certain areas of the world are going up, particularly for poor people, and environmental concerns aren't being listened to. Again, typically in the poorest parts of the world. So, a lot of times what'll happen is Coca-Cola might buy a plot of land that might belong to, an indigenous Nigerian tribe, for example. There's one case would be the famous Ogoni land case. But basically Coca-Cola bought land that belonged to people, which is illegal. But, they never really had a piece of paper saying that they owned the land. It was just their land. It was just understood to be their land. But Coca-Cola basically bribed the government to buy the land, and then they put up a factory there, and it damaged this tribe in Nigeria's their well-being, and they had a very reasonable reason to be mad about that. I would be mad too if somebody decided that, oh hey, this fourth of your condo, that belongs to Coca-Cola now. You didn't actually own it, right? Like, I would be pissed off. I'd be angry too. So maybe I don't mean to give my bias away. Maybe I'm pretty much a believer in the WTO. I think it does more good than harm. But when it does harm, it typically does a lot of harm to a lot of people. So there's definitely reasons to be skeptical too. So just keep an open mind and weigh where you think the harms are and where you think the goods are. I'm not here to get you to subscribe to my economic beliefs. We can leave that for office hours if you want. But the protests that you saw in 1999, they're more or less, if you look at their list of demands, it reads like an explanation of these three things. It's not fair for domestic labor, like people in Detroit, that the United States is shipping jobs to Mexico. It's also not fair for Mexican workers who probably are shipping off their goods at a lower price. They're not getting their price is probably higher or closer to their opportunity costs. So they're not getting the equal gains from trade. You might say that Coca-Cola is producing in my tribal lands, and they're polluting things that we use to produce. Okay, they're driving away livestock, or they're using up our rivers, which we use to bathe or whatever. Or I don't know. I don't know very much about Ogoni land and their practices, but you get my point. Coca-Cola will be having, by virtue of buying land that doesn't really belong to them, is leaving a negative externality. Or, in the case of the medical industry, there's imperfect competition because medicines have patents, which is a government-induced monopoly. And they might be pricing at a higher cost than is maybe fair or maybe the most beneficial for people who need to get their medication. So all three things I think are reasonable gripes to have, and you can balance that against what you think the gains from trade are. Okay, and I label the 1999 one, but these are recurring themes. So you'll see them in socialist groups, you'll see them in anarchist socialist groups, any fair trade group, labor groups, environmentalists, people who are against globalization. You see it. You go outside to a BLM protest, you'll hear the same things being said here that were said 21 years ago in 1999 at the WTO protest. Again, but with more of a obviously a more BIPOC kind of bend to it. Obviously, because it's what they're truly protesting. This is more of an add-on. But you'll see it with, like, Antifa would say things like that. Occupy Wall Street, if you remember that, back in 2011, would say that. Even the Tea Party in 2008, even though they're for markets, kind of had some of these gripes too, just maybe in a different flavor. Maybe that's not fully what they were protesting, so I don't want to misrepresent what Tea Party was about, because they are generally against government regulation. But they do have some of these, particularly when it comes to fair trade, some of these gripes. And you'll see this even with Bernie Sanders or Trump, even though they're on complete opposite sides of the political spectrum. I'm doing air quotes because I don't think there's truly a political spectrum the way that most people conceive of it. But even though they're supposed to be on opposite sides, they're both very much for fair trade. So I talked about these three things, so I'm not going to talk about it any further. But the point is, markets can fail, and they'll typically fail for some of these three reasons, where producers might have high market control, there might be externalities, or even though there's efficiencies to be gained, they might be unfair. Right? So if you want to go back and look, you can go into the lecture slides and you can look on some of the Seattle protests. Or you can look outside your window and you can listen to what the protesters are saying now, and you'll probably hear some of this stuff here, because it's about race, but it's also about more than race for a lot of people.